I'm Chris Cook. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise. Our next session is titled Debt, Do We Want More of It or Less? And we've got a stellar lineup, really, to talk through this quite complicated question. It's a really tough thing, in part because the word debt is such a broad and comprehensive idea. For a person who's borrowing, it's obviously an obligation. For people who own the debt, it's obviously an asset. We're going to have to talk, when we think about debt, about public borrowing. We're going to have to think about private borrowing. We have to think about companies and individuals. And when people think about what worries them with debt, there's always something that worries them, but they quite often, their solution is for someone else to run up new debts instead of the people they're worried about. For our panel today, let's start with the first person who will be speaking in a moment, who is Emre Tiftik, who is the Director of Sustainability Research at the Institute of International Finance. And Emre, I hope will be able to give us a big overview of the sort of the global position. We've also got joining us, although there's, I believe, some technical issues, Eric Lonergan, who is a macro hedge fund manager, economist and writer. He's written a book on angrynomics. He really wants more debt, but he's one of those people that has a specific kind of debt in mind. He's a big fan of government action. We've then got Selina Flavius, who is the author of Black Girl Finance, and Black Girl Finance, I should say, as well as also an institution, an agency. Selina can I hope give us a good view, if you like, from the ground. She's working with people at the moment with personal debt issues, and I hope we're going to have a bit of a chat. Actually, the name of her book, she gives you a bit of a hint that she's interested in some of the cultural baggage around debt. And then finally, we have Amy Chappell, who's in charge of customer management at Capita. If you've heard, for example, about things like the mortgage holiday the government implemented recently, Capita are doing lots of the nuts and bolts work to deliver that. The process of making customers and businesses smarter about debt is a big thing that Capita's involved in. So anyway, I was going to start by going to Emre. And Emre, I was just wondering if you could start off by giving us a bit of a sense of what debt is there, and should we be, how sustainable is it? That's a really easy, brief question for you. Oh, we can't hear you, Emre. Tom is going to pester you, Emre, and try and help you figure out what's going on. Amy, I guess the first question from your perspective is what do you think how do you think we should think about debt, and what do we get wrong about debt?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start from the customer's perspective, right? And we'll start from the individual, and we'll work our way out to the question today. So, I think if the things that we're thinking very much about is how do you help customers in a time now where potentially they're experiencing uncomfortable debt, maybe for the first time in their lives, right? So the pandemic has certainly made that more likely for for a number of people. I think things like the FCA are saying that there's more people now in the UK in financial risk because of COVID. And I guess for me, it's all about how the brands treat customers in this moment. Because, this is a moment where we have a real opportunity, if we do it right, to create the kind of intimacy between customers and brands that will actually last into the long term. You've got to treat people with respect, and you've got to help them understand how they can pay, but how they can pay over time. It's kind of like when you're wealthy, you can afford debt. You use debt to extend your opportunity, right? We use it in our mortgages and our car financing and other things like that. But when you find yourself in financial challenge, and I'm sure Selina's going to talk us through this much more expertly than me. But as we look at that moment, for us, it's all about, that relationship. And the one thing brands can do is they can really understand their customers better. There's so much data out there, both to help people as they potentially approach debt, but as importantly, as they potentially think about getting out of debt. And and approaching that relationship with the kind of respect that will lead to a longer term outcome for both. You're going to ask a question, Chris. I can see the curiosity.
I mean, I was just wondering is part of the challenge for you about the fact that, if you like, the short run incentives for companies are to try and get you to borrow to buy the next thing, but that's not, where you want companies to be?
Well, you've got to approach these relationships with some kind of responsibility, right? There's no good for anyone if we lend money to people who end up not being able to pay. That's not good for anyone. But at the same time, I think by understanding customers and giving people opportunity to use debt in the right way, and then helping people when they are in debt who potentially didn't in the COVID situation, think about how many people did not expect to be in a situation where paying bills or paying mortgages or paying for minutes on your phone were going to be challenges. Thinking about that relationship right now, in this moment, and thinking about the long-term part of that relationship is crucial if brands want to be relevant to their customers in the long run. How you treat people in this moment, how you treat people when they're struggling for debt, will set the tone for the brand going forward.
Okay, cool. Selena, I wonder if I can come to you next. Just reflecting on Amy's thought there. So you both have written your book, which came out last month. You work with people on the ground on their personal finances.
Yeah.
How has the last kind of year been? What have you seen?
It's been really stressful, just being completely honest and blunt. And I've done some work with Money and Pension Service. And, if you look at data from the Citizens Advice Bureau, you are seeing that people are actually, wanting advice for the first time about accessing, benefits, the benefit system, navigating their way through the benefit system that they've never had to do before. We are in a situation whereby, we've heard conversations around what jobs are now viable and unviable. Where for a lot of people, they've had their jobs for the past 5, 10, 15 years, been completely able to manage and support themselves, and suddenly the rug's been pulled from underneath them. And typically when we talk about personal finance and making sure you have savings for an emergency fund, we talk about when the car's breaking down or when the boiler packs up. And now we're talking about when you have suddenly been made redundant, or perhaps your income is lowered because you're now on furlough, and that's stretched for months. We talk about 3 to 6 months, but now, COVID's been a year. I was thinking about this today. The last time I was out meeting up with my girlfriends was a whole year ago to today. So it's been a long time. People are really struggling, and also with the lack of access to, the mental health support that we would typically get. People are going to be approaching, these financial services even more vulnerable than they would usually be in normal times, when everything's okay. So I think, and I can see some comments as well, talking about the experience of when you are approaching these financial services because you have issues or because you're struggling. It's difficult to do that in normal times. We see people shy away, don't answer letters, don't avoid phone calls. So I just guess within the UK and in general, dealing with debt can be very difficult. Mustering up the courage to take that first step, to make that phone call to someone like myself, or to even Citizens Advice Bureau or Step Change. We can't, we have to applaud people who take that step, and I feel like they're the bravest, because it's not easy. And I know that from personal experience, and how we are treated by these financial institutions as well is super, super important. One of my jobs is to make people understand that, yes, if you are experiencing debt, it's not the end of the world. You're not a terrible person, particularly when it's COVID. This is something completely outside of our control. But it's just to reassure people that, make that phone call. It's difficult, it's hard, make that phone call. And also making people understand that financial institutions also owe them a duty of care as well. So I'm a big believer in talking about that fact as well. People deserve to be treated with respect regardless of their financial situation. And I think what Amy said was absolutely true. How you are treated by an institution now will hopefully forge a long-term relationship. And also another job of mine as a finance coach is to I guess, get people to understand that it's a mutual thing. There are mutual benefits from us, saving in a bank account, or opening up an investment account. There are mutual benefits. So it's kind of getting that message across as well. So it's kind of talking to actual individuals about it, and also trying to bridge that gap at the same time.
So your book and your institution is arrestingly called Black Girl Finance.
Is. Yeah, it's a very bold name.
One of the things I thought was one of the things you sort of raised is the importance of sort of cultural norms about debt in the and how. I mean, I think it's if you ever, like, the financial press is always full of these things about like German savers and Japanese savers and British credit card debtors. That's kind of how the world is constructed in the financial press. One of the things that we should be thinking about here is also the fact that there'll be differential impacts of this experience, because different people are basically more ashamed of debt, I think, is the simplest way to think of it. Does that fit?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to explain, the book is called Black Girl Finance because I grew up in a culture whereby we don't talk about money, and come to think about it, now that the book's out and speaking to everybody, I think it's just kind of the norm, really, particularly if you're a woman, and particularly if you are from a BAME background. And we do see some things that are seen, some behaviors, financial behaviors and decisions that are made based on culture. For example, I'm from a Black Caribbean background, and the tradition of something called a partner scheme is quite normal. Perhaps if you are from a kind of South Asian background, you might see the tradition of, making sure you have a partner before you get on the property ladder. You're married before you get on the property ladder. And it could extend to who holds the purse strings, who makes those financial decisions as well. So these are things that we don't often think about, but we should think about. Because we do things differently culturally, and I created the platform just so that I could have a safe space for Black women to talk about money, have initial conversations about money, and make it okay. So that was the idea behind it. But I mean, it kind of opens up conversations around culture and money, across the board, and so it's quite interesting.
Cool. I was wondering on that, if we could go to Eric, because Eric's thesis at the moment is that we do need more debt, but the solution, if you like, to some of the financial problems that Selena and Amy have talked about is that the debt should be government debt, and we need more aggressive government action. Is that a fair sort of summary of where you are, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I think also you could have more private sector debt as well, but it depends how it's priced and where it goes. So I guess there's a couple of key points I would make about the whole sort of debt debate. And the first one relates to the government. Government debt is very, very different to private sector debt, because government debt is treated by financial markets as a safety asset. Now, what that sort of means in English is that the rate of interest has been extraordinarily low on government debt. So the UK government can borrow at close to zero interest rates fixed for 20 years. That's one very, very important point. And so what you use that debt for, you can actually borrow more and create value. So if you simply thought of it like a buy-to-let program, if you get a higher rental income than you're paying on your mortgage, you're actually creating assets because you can repay your debt through time. Well, if you think about it, the UK government can borrow fixed for 20 years at a negative real interest rate. That means all it needs to do is make a positive real return on any investment, and effectively it's creating value. That is an extraordinary generational opportunity, which is profoundly relevant to us at the moment. For example, if we think of the climate challenge, I actually think almost the problem of climate change, we're lucky because we have a huge opportunity to do a huge amount of investment spending, and we have a negative real cost of capital. So that's really important. The other thing about the government that's really important is we've actually bought most of our debt back. Now, people get confused by this because it's called strange names like quantitative easing and the Bank of England's balance sheet, and nobody really understands it. It's actually quite simple. We've actually bought back our debt. Now, if you think about it, let's say you bought back your mortgage. Do you still have a mortgage? Well, not really, because you're paying yourself. So the UK government bought back a hell of a lot. I mean, the Bank of England owns between 25 and 30% of our debt. So actually, the numbers of our debt are very misleading because we actually own an awful lot of it already. And the final point I would make is the role for the private sector. And here I think we need more innovation. So we need innovation about how we think about the state's balance sheet. So what are we going to do with this windfall gift, which is negative real interest rates for 20 years? How are we going to take advantage of that as a state? And then as a private sector, we need innovation because we should have negative interest rates. And we should have negative interest rates in the private sector to finance a revival of a greening of our economy. And if you want to level up, to use those terms, both environmentally, but also regionally, we should do it at negative interest rates. Now, if you think about it, negative interest rates, is that a liability or an asset? If I'm getting paid effectively to make an investment, that totally alters the calculus. So I actually think that this whole debate has been misconstrued because we are in new circumstances, but there are actually extraordinary opportunities to make real transformations to our economy based on where interest rates are and based on the fact that interest rates to the government are fixed for very, very long periods of time.
Okay. So Alice Gaskell has just mentioned in the chat, didn't we spend too much before we got to this point, so we can't afford to take advantage of this windfall gift? I mean, the one of the things I think would be quite helpful if you spelled out is, I mean, in my head, because I'm old enough, I think of 3%, a deficit of 3%. So if the government borrows 3% of annual income or more, that gets a bit frightening and tricky. You know, I have like an intuitive worry about that. Do you think that people like me need to just back off and be more?
Well, let me. Yeah, it's a great question. Let me just explain a really simple. Try and make a simple. What is fundamentally a very simple point. Let's say the UK government issued a 15-year government bond, right? It's called a gilt, right? Now they can currently do that for, let's make it say 20 years, because the 20-year gilt market is a very well accepted part of the market. Right? They can currently do that at negative real interest rates. So that is after inflation, it's a negative real interest rate. Now let's say they do 10% of GDP, right? So we do 10% of our economy. That's a big number, 200 billion or so pounds. And then they take it and they invest it. And on their investments, they make a 5% real return, right? So in other words, the return on the investment generates an income. Let's say it's a wind power. So they invest in wind power and they make a 6% real return. In 15 years' time, they'll be able to repay all of the debt based on the return on their asset. So right. Actually, in 15 years' time or in 20 years' time, you've actually created an asset and you've repaid your debt. So the most important thing is, what are you doing with your debt and what returns are you generating? So, and it's this. What I think it is important is one doesn't want to necessarily just, be giving the money away and running large deficits just simply through making transfers. That's obviously very important to stabilize everybody's income during a pandemic. But as we look forward over 5 or 10 years, we need to be making capital investments. We have a desperate need to transform our economy, both in the regions and both in terms of its sustainability. And we can borrow at negative real interest rates, right? That is a gift.
Right. Thank you ever so much. Emre, I think we've got you back, and hopefully we can hear you. No! Not yet. Not sorry. We'll come back, Emre. It's the you're unmuted. We'll come back. I guess I mean, one of the sort of challenges that really sort of emerges from all of this is the fact that you kind of have to pick a sector, right? Like someone if we're going to power consumption, someone has to be doing the borrowing and spending to get through the next few years. Amy, I'm just wondering, I mean, one of the things that you've been doing recently is thinking as well about new sources of credit for. Oh, Emery, can we hear you now? We can't hear you. Sorry.
Oh. No, that was me. Oh, there he is. Oh.
No. So Amy, Well, sorry.
Let's try again.
The devilish, isn't it? And one of the things when we spoke before, you mentioned that you're talking to employers about work they can do with their employees.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. So I guess it's really interesting to listen to something like Eric talk about the economy and how we invest debt and things like that, and for I think Selena and I to then talk about the implications of what that means for people. But I think as we work together to think about, maybe it's about gaining financial responsibility, right? Around how do we understand and really get to understand debt in the terms of where we're working. So one of the things that Capita has is we have like a little venture capital kind of business, and we invest in brands and help them grow. And one of those is a company called Level. And what I really love about it is it's a offering that you create for employees that helps them to manage their money, their debt. And so where many employees who might be in a vulnerable category might go out to, for example, a payday lender or something like that, and start growing debt beyond their capability. This kind of nudges them. It uses a nudge theory to help them just manage their money as they go. But it also allows them to do things when they do need to borrow against their paycheck if they need to, so they can get some advances. And it just creates that, I guess, that literacy around managing our money. And do you know what? I mean, I know that in comparison to maybe some of those people, I have a lot of privilege, but I absolutely know that I, who've grown up in a pretty, experienced kind of way of dealing with money, don't have all the literacy or all the language that I need to understand debt and understand when you should expand on it and when you shouldn't as an individual. And I think probably when I think about it as a business, I probably have more guidance around me. But those tools like Level can help me take that same discipline and put it back in my life, right? And think about that. So I think that's one of the interesting things for thinking about how does an organization offer that back into their employee set, so that we create literacy almost as a financial well-being program, as much as we think about the maybe emotional well-being. And I think that again is more important than ever right now. How do we create that literacy?
Okay, so I mean, Eric, that's a sort of, as a novel sort of thing. I guess it's like the extension of the season ticket loan, which is a thing I understand into something potentially a bigger sector. But Eric, you mentioned you thought corporates could do more generally too, and that that corporate borrowing has a role to play in the coming years as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the areas I think is that we really need some brave, innovative thinking is to do with monetary policy. At the moment, in effect, what's happened is interest rates are so low that further reductions in interest rates aren't going to really make any difference to the economy. And more QE isn't either, because it's causing all sorts of challenges within the context of the financial system. But what the Bank of England could do is introduce something called dual interest rates and targeted lending. And this has been done by, some people may remember the term funding scheme, the TFS scheme. Unfortunately, a lot of these acronyms are kind of hidden away in sort of central bank technicalities. Cut a long story short.
This is credit easing, right? This is sort of targeted.
Well, effectively what they do is they lend to the banks. The Bank of England lend to the banks at very low interest rates, contingent on the banks extending loans to small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, here's the thing. The problem with negative interest rates is if you start charging negative interest rates on depositors, you're going to depress spending in the economy and you incentivize people to take their money out of banks. But if you cut the interest rate solely on the funding for banks, right? So you leave official interest rates unchanged. The deposits rates don't change, but you set up funding schemes for banks at steeply negative interest rates. For example, let's say you go minus 5% interest rate for 4 years. But the banks are required to lend that to the corporate sector investing in sustainable energy, right? So it's targeted lending at negative interest rates. Now that completely changes the arithmetic and would supercharge green investment spending. You could do the same for infrastructure in the regions. You could do the same for ports. So we have huge amounts of power. The only problem here is this is innovation. Yeah. Right, the Bank of England hasn't done this before, and we are dealing with hugely conservative stasis in thinking. But some central banks, if you look at what the Bank of Japan did after Fukushima, they did something similar. The European Central Bank is doing something similar now. And this would be really, really powerful. And if you start providing loans to companies to invest in sustainable energy, to green our economy, for electric vehicle sales, for charging stations throughout the economy, for people to get mortgages, 1% lower, conditional on, people doing insulation, there is a huge amount of innovation we could do. And again, it's a huge opportunity. And it would also give the Bank of England a role again, because the reality is we've become totally dependent on fiscal policy. And the Bank of England now has really run out of conventional tools.
Right. And Selina, I wonder if I could come to you, because I think the case, I think it's been quite a pro-debt discussion we've had so far. Actually, I'm just wondering if would you hope in 5 years' time, say, looking ahead, that we would have less household debt? I mean, I think the Eric's plan, I think, if I understand correctly, is that we can drive consumption through government and business consumption more, and that would hopefully take the pressure off households. That should, if we have better growth, the household balance sheet will improve a bit.
I mean, I think it would be great, if we could get an account without having to pay the cost for, a zero interest bank account. That'd be amazing. And if you could get a mortgage with lower interest rate, that would be amazing. So that's good. Just to say, I'm not completely totally anti-debt, because in my experience I talk to people who are, some people are overly indebted and really struggling, and some people are in debt and they are using it to build wealth, to create assets, to the example that you gave about get on the property ladder and rent out the property to create assets. And one of the big chapters in the book is around asset, because I want people to create wealth. I don't want people to just kind of save. That was the message maybe 30 years ago, for my parents when they moved over here, immigrated and had to get themselves established. We have a lot more opportunity now as first and second generation people and family, and especially with all of the tech and the innovation that's out there, if we could come up with newer solutions to do as kind of Eric suggested, that would be amazing. So I'm not totally anti-debt, although I've had some experience of debt, but I'm still, I'm a property owner. I rent out my property, I earn income that way, I invest as well. I've been burnt. I invested in Neil Woodward's fund. But do I still invest? Yes, I do. Do I still use these financial systems? Yes, I do, because I see the real benefit of doing so. So that's kind of my opinion with regards to, I'm not totally anti-debt. We have student loan system which people leverage, and they, there are benefits to getting that education, and if by having a loan that's the only way you can do it, that's great. And equally, schemes that have been in place, like I saw a debate on Twitter that was around the Klarna, the buy now pay later schemes going to be regulated. For a lot of people, although we don't like Bright House and we don't need to shop there ourselves, for a lot of people who can't afford to just buy a washing machine, etc., there are uses for it. So there are uses for debt. There are ways that we can leverage it to build wealth or just to get the essentials that we need. So I'm not totally anti-debt, but that education piece around financial literacy, how you can manage it, how you can pay it back, how you can use it to build wealth for yourself, that's what I'm kind of for.
Okay, that's so. Amy, I wonder if I can come to you on that thought on if you like bad debt, because I think I mean, you talked about at the beginning about this sort of enlightened approach to debt that you hope your business customers would take. I mean, Bright House is a quite a good example of a place that very much taken the opposite view. But also, I do wonder about how much of this, I do wonder how sort of far you can push the enlightened self-interest before the unenlightened self-interest becomes overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, so I guess the question is really how can you help people avoid getting into the situation where they have unpayable debt, like just you get to that whole end of that collection cycle. I guess from a brand perspective, if I think about it as, you know, a representative of many of my clients who are interacting with their customers, you know, what we are also often trying to do is use data, artificial intelligence, other things around that information spectrum to help ensure that we're putting approaches and plans together that allow for more intimacy in the relationship during that cycle of trying to figure out how people are going to move from having bad debt into having debt that they can actually manage and pay for in some way, and trying to avoid going down that, you know, ugly collections end of the scale where, you know, the people show up at your front door and take your television. So, you know, what brands can do is think about how do they use all of the information around there to ensure that they really understand customers, because customers are all, you know, I think as Lena said, people are often embarrassed when they're in that situation. But if you can work with them to help make the debt experience more positive, and often, you know, that can be things like moving into digital as a way of interacting. People are less embarrassed to have conversations about money often if they can have them in that digital format, and understand what their options are. And then I think, you know, as we think about thinking about the when you do get into that area where people are struggling, you know, how can you create a more human approach to that? You know, I also think, you know, just connecting to what Eric's saying, you know, I think right now there's a level of worry that's going on about how does this situation on an individual level relate to the situation on the economic level that the country is taking. You know, we see that the furlough scheme is, I think, extended again. And what does that actually mean for how the world's going to operate? You know, small business owners who've been struggling, they've taken the loans. You know, many of the brands that I work with are trying to prepare for what's going to happen next, whether that's around the benefit cycle or whether that's around the pay cycle for these loans that have come out around furlough. And trying to understand, I guess, the economic strategy of how we get out of the COVID environment. And what is that going to look like from a practical perspective for us as individuals, for our communities, and then for the wider economy. And I think we have a lot of people worried about that cycle right now, not really, again, it's that literacy, not necessarily knowing how the macroeconomic and microeconomic elements that many people can talk about so eloquently relate to their debt cycle in this individual moment right now. So I think those are the things that are on people's minds, both at a brand level and at a customer level.
Okay. Can we come to Tessa, my colleague Tessa? So I mean, one of the things that I think is really it's a good question that you're not allowed to ask questions at Thinkins. So it's a good pointed comment that she raises about whether we're using the wrong tools for this moment.
Sorry, is she me, Chris, or is it Cat's mother?
Yeah.
Okay, just checking. I'm still slightly back in the wealth tax conversation at lunchtime, actually, and thinking about how if we're not to recreate the same mistakes post 2007, 2008, 2009, and double down on people least able to repay, how are we going to approach this really differently? And what will we have learned from that we apply to this situation? So I'm just going to end up repeating everything that Eric says, because I obviously deeply agree with him on all things, including our mutual Sopranos. Hi, Eric. We used to work together. You know, this bold move, these negative interest rates, how do you release capital where it really, really needs to get to, where it really needs to get into regions and SMEs, which are going to stop large tranches of the economy falling over post-COVID? How are you going to support 2.5 million unemployed in the country? And, you know, we can't just keep kind of going back to the same things we've done before and hoping they'll work. So I love, you know, I'm desperate to see this sort of bold innovation. You know that I've wanged on about negative interest rates, and you and I've maybe slightly disagreed on them, Chris, not sure. But where's this change going to come from? Is Sunak really going to have the political capital to, really mix things up and take on a wealth tax, which is essentially taking most of his voter base out at their recently replaced knees?
Okay. I wonder if we could come, thanks, Tessa. I wonder if we could come to Sam Drury, who I think, I'm hopeful that the elves behind the scenes have already approached. Hello.
Hi.
Hiya.
Hello.
So you made in the chat, you made a really interesting point about accountability, really, isn't it? And responsibility. Could you just give us
sorry, I was completely zoned out. Thank you so much. And I'm really enjoying this. Sorry, buying time now by complimenting everybody how much I'm enjoying this this session, and the sessions seem to get better and better. So accountability, yes. Well, so when we're talking about debt and talking about institutions and countries, which is how we started out, and there's a different level of accountability. So the consequences to a government to enter into debt is not necessarily the same for that individual, because they might not be in power when it comes home to roost. Whereas for individuals, it's different. And for example, with this government borrowing huge amounts, and of course we are in the middle of a pandemic, but even another type of government where we're borrowing lots and then investing, they get a lot of kudos for it. But for an individual, it's different. I think the point that I was making was about what Eric and Selina were talking about, which is the difference between good debt and bad debt. It seems to be that if it's used responsibly, whether by an individual or for investment purposes in the green economy by institutions using the tool of negative interest rates, then that's a good thing. But if it's to spend on empty calories, or the equivalent of, so to spend on bad debt, then that's a bad thing. That was just the point I was making.
I think, well, I think the thing that I was struck by was you talking about about the responsibility the lender has for how good the debt is.
Yes, so if an individual makes a bad decision, and this also goes back to the previous session where we were talking about corruption in financial institutions and watchdogs. If an individual gets into debt, then they can lose their house, they can go to jail, they can have so many consequences. Whereas for an institution to get into debt, the consequences are different. And again, the pejorative view that is held, or the judgmental view that is held about individuals getting into debt, it's rather like gambling. The institutions don't seem to take that much responsibility for it. And this is a point that I was thinking about earlier, where somebody who is becoming a problem gambler, an institution actually sees them as a source for regular income and dependable income in a way, because they're addicted. And the personal debt cycle, which people get into with credit cards, or can get into it with credit cards, and I think Selina will probably be able to talk about this with helping people with personal debt, the institution doesn't seem to bear responsibility, and they will continue to lend to people like that. You know, there are apocryphal, or maybe not apocryphal stories, but certainly individual stories of people who committed suicide having had credit card debt, and then continuing to receive offers for more credit cards through the post. And I think that was my point about responsibility of the institution towards the individual.
Thanks ever so much. I think we'll come to Amy on that actually in a moment. I feel that's a big part of what Capita has been working on that. But actually, I was wondering if we could come to Eric first. I'm confusing the people doing the unmuting and everything else. But if we go to Eric first, actually, because there are a few things there. I think, Amy, you brought up, that we're in this strange moment in basically the debt and the credit cycle. We're in this peculiar macroeconomic moment, and there's sort of and I think she and Tessa both allude to the same issue, which is about how we unpack and what the sort of macro solutions are at this particular stage. And I mean, one of the things Tessa also brought up in the chat was on whether the toolkit we're using to get through the next sort of 6 month year are the right things. Where do you sit on that, Eric?
I mean, I'm completely sympathetic to what both of them said. I totally agree. And I think the challenge really here is to innovate with policy along the sort of lines that I described, which is, so what we've really had is a huge amount of government borrowing effectively to stabilize everybody's incomes and cash flows. That's really what we've tried to do. We've sort of tried to put the economy in a freezer and make sure that it gets through this phase, and now we're defrosting it. But we need to go back and have a growth strategy. And we've got some serious emergencies. We've got an emergency with income and wealth inequality, and we've got an emergency with the environment and with regional inequality. And so the growth trajectory has to be along those lines. But I think there's huge opportunity because you can use negative term funding by the Bank of England to target the relevant sectors. And you can use the state's balance sheet also to finance capital expenditure. But I just want to make, if I could just make one other point, I think is actually really important, is wealth and income inequality. I think wealth tax is a dead end. It has a tiny impact, right? It just makes you feel better. But the real point is to give assets to people who don't have assets. And I, again, want to use the state's balance sheet creatively. So I would like the UK government to set up an endowment like Norway has, and it finances by issuing gilts. Now, if you look at, there are lots of endowments, whether they're university endowments or the Wellcome Trust, and they invest in global assets, and they tend to generate something like a 4 to 6% return. We should issue gilts, create an endowment, and then issue ownership, give ownership of the endowments to the people in the UK who don't have assets. That is a far more effective and transformational strategy than messing around with wealth taxes. The key point is, about 60, 70% of the population don't really have any assets. And the government is in a position effectively to acquire assets on their behalf. But this requires innovation. We have a totally different state cost of capital. We're in a completely different world. We need new policies.
Okay, thanks. All right. I was wondering if we could come to Amy next to pick up some of those threads. So there's the Sam's point about responsibility of lenders in particular.
There's 2 or 3 things in there. So I think it's interesting that the call I was on the hour before this was with Jack Parsons, who's the head of the youth group, which is a big influencer on the whole youth agenda. And I think as you think about potentially disenfranchised populations at the moment who might be experiencing more challenges, certainly the experience of our young people over the last 12 months and as we expect the next generation is going to be a really important one in the economy, and the things they care about around sustainability and other things are also going to feed into that. But I guess if you just go back to the brands, I think remembering that almost all of the industries have an interest in vulnerable customers and treating and understanding and recognizing vulnerable customers. I mean, one of my key metrics, and we serve hundreds of brands at the moment, and one of the key metrics, whether it's in utilities or in financial services or in things like gaming and other things which we've spoken about, being able to identify a vulnerable customer and help put them on a path to safety in their choices is actually one of the key metrics that we're measured on as we work with those brands and interact with their customers. And I think financial vulnerability is one of those things. Addiction is another one of those vulnerabilities. The inability to pay, but potentially being in an unsafe environment, whether it's for utilities or other things like that, is another vulnerable customer. And certainly dealing with people who are threatening suicide and other things is something we've seen quite a lot, a real spike in, certainly around benefits, around financial payments. And we've had to spend a fair amount of time in this last year really helping our employees prepare for those, both identifying and then dealing with those things. So I think we have to know that both the regulation that's in place and the interest of those companies is to actually ensure that you both can identify and then interact with those vulnerable customers in a responsible way. It's a really core part of purpose, right? But that doesn't mean that it always happens. We know that's true, and that's why we end up with people in challenging situations. But I think we're going to see, as I said earlier, we're all at the moment across the industries preparing for what happens next. we've stood up centers in the last year that were thinking that the bow wave would be right now, because we thought that the furlough scheme was going to end. We thought that the payments on some of the loans was going to start. And as the government pushes those things out and continues to invest in that future, it actually is helping that, as Eric described it, the frozen economy right now. And I guess then we have to think about that thawing, because I actually do believe that debt in the right places is going to be the thing that's going to get us out of this, allowing us to invest in the right communities, the right way. And I think our mindsets have changed, because we all have spent more time in our homes and in our local communities than we have probably in a decade. So our mindsets about where that money should be spent might be quite different today than if you asked us 12 months ago.
Okay, thank you ever so much. I was wondering if we could come to Gregory Mulligan. So Gregory's raised something in the chat that if you've ever written about personal finance, you will recognize Gregory's concern, which is about interest rates. Gregory.
Sorry, I was getting myself organized. I'm muting, whatever.
So one of the things, if you ever write about personal finance, you always get people who say you should be worried about the fact that interest rates are so low, because it means that people who've done the right thing and saved don't get rewarded for it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's people often think, I asked the question really earlier, and just whether there is a moral aspect of negative interest rates, and that, a rate of interest is the reward for something foregone. There's a kind of moral fundamental to it. I'm not sure if I believe that. I was posing it as a question on the chat, and I'm actually very grateful for so much of the commentary on the chat. It's been very, very interesting. But I think because interest rates and move generally so slowly through time, and people are dealing with their lives incrementally, we often don't realize just how transformative the social implications are for the way rates are. That, some of us may remember in the 70s when rates were at 25% and just destroyed a whole number of people's, livelihoods and what they'd worked for through their life for 20 years, destroyed their pensions. And likewise, when we have interest rates at this kind of level, I think we need to really think about what the distributive and the broader long-term social implications are. I guess the other question in terms of what was being discussed about sovereign debt is, I've actually was trying to find out just how much of our debt is, the government debt that's been issued is index linked, and how much of it is just fixed rate, because that's a very, very important distinction. I think that goes along with the distinction as to whether we have issued debt in our own currency or another currency. Your ability to control things is so much greater if it's in your own currency.
Thank you ever so much, Gregory. I was wondering if I could come to Selina, who will be our last contribution, I think, for the day, because I think there is like a simple economist reply to Gregory, which is we run interest rates so that we can, to make to maximize basically the welfare of the population. And sometimes that means very low interest rates for savers, and that's unpleasant for savers, but we have to, think of everyone. But actually, Selina, there's another problem, isn't there, with, if you like, the flip side of Eric's enthusiasm about borrowing for the state and for companies, is that we're moving in, we are in an environment where there is a lot of easy credit for people. People can get into trouble more quickly perhaps than in previous times.
Absolutely. There's lots of conversations going on Snapchat and now Clubhouse, which is the newest social media platform, about cryptocurrency and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, I do feel like, again, that kind of education piece around financial products is super, super important, how to leverage them, how to use them in the best way possible, because and it's the young people who are the early adopters of all of this technology. they tend to run with it. And again, things being accessible via your phone and mobile phone apps as well, people are starting to invest and dabble, and being able to invest and dabble at very small amounts as well. Again, I'd argue we need that education piece to keep up with that.
Yeah, I mean, it may actually amazed me during the GameStop thing to discover that American consumers can buy financial products that you basically need a degree to be able to buy in Britain. Just on their app. Anyway, thank you ever so much, all of you. Thank you to Emre, who tried to join us but was defeated by modern technology. It sounds trite, but the fundamental conclusion that we need more good debt and less bad debt is actually quite a profound idea. And actually, I'm sort of interested I'm pleased actually that Eric managed to get into dual interest rates, whether we can try and separate what people save at and what people borrow at as an idea. Although I mean, it's quite a thing, right? And it's quite a thing to get around. The law of one price for economists is a thing that's quite hard to escape. Thank you to Eric, to Selina, to Amy. Thank you to Gregory, and to everyone who took part.